my name is David Levi. I'm a program manager. I'm on the SQL migrations team, actually the database migration team, but I work a lot with the SQL migrations. So, kind of just to give you some background here, I started out my career as a developer, and somewhere along the way learned how to tune queries. I didn't realize that was a scarce skill until people found out I could tune queries. All of a sudden I was moved to the DBA team, and I was a DBA from there. So I went real deep on the technical side, down the DBA path. I actually earned my Microsoft Certified Master back when that was a thing. And that was a lot of fun, going deep into the technical. After that, I was looking for something else to do, another challenge, and I decided I was going to go get an MBA. I mean, how hard could that be? Turns out it was really hard. Looking at everything from a completely different perspective, looking at the business perspective, the business drivers, why we do things, it really put a new spin on it. And actually, it showed me that a lot of the business drivers are harder than the technical drivers. Business, you really have to look at the insights and figure out what's going on for your particular situation. Technical, yeah, there are situational details, but it's really one or two options. There's really not a lot of argument that goes into it. There's only a few ways to solve problems. So I like to focus on the business as I go through this, and we'll also do the technical. And I do have a demo. It's a fully technical demo, so we'll actually show off the tools. It's actually a really cool demo. We're super proud of it. We take an entire VMware host and we do an analysis on it, and we show how quickly you can get the sizing information for all the VMs on it to move to Azure. So that's coming up about the middle of the session. Don't leave early. All right, so let's go through the agenda. We're going to talk about the Azure SQL ecosystem, just to do a little bit of level setting. We'll talk about migration planning. Then we'll talk about migration tools, what the options are, based on what you're trying to do. And then we're going to talk a bit about optimizing your SQL environment. So I was in support and sales before I was in PM. I got to do a lot of work with customers, helping them migrate to Azure. And then once they're on Azure, helping them to run better. One of the things that usually comes into running better is, hey, we've gotten a couple bills that are really high. We'd like those to go down by a lot, like maybe half. So, how do we optimize? How do we take advantage of the different levers that are out there to go and save money? So let's talk about the Azure SQL ecosystem. How many people have seen this slide before? Or the variant that's the pizza as a service? So David Pless over there in the corner told me I wasn't allowed to use pizza as a service anymore. He gets mad when I use it. So I have to use this one. So what does it mean for everybody else who hasn't seen this slide before? What does it mean to run as a service? So if we look at this left-hand column, and really we're just level setting here. If we look at this left-hand column, that's on-prem. So when you're running on-prem, look at all the things you're responsible for. Everything from networking to storage to servers, virtualization. You got to take care of the OS, the middleware, the runtime, the data, the applications. And actually, you could dig further into this. When you're on-prem, you have to worry about where your electricity comes from, how many internet providers you have. I live in the Midwest of the US, so every spring when the ground thaws, they go out with backhoes and start doing construction and inevitably dig up fiber optic lines. So, how many internet providers do you have in case one of those fiber-seeking backhoes goes and gets your primary internet connection? And we actually call them that, fiber-seeking backhoes. That's not a new thing. When you go to infrastructure as a service, you get rid of a lot of the hardware, the infrastructure. So you're really only worried about the OS, the middleware, the runtime, the data, and the applications. Now this is the huge change here, because in this column, you have to plan 3 to 5 years out when you size your machines. You have to say, I'm going to guess, and I'm going to give my best guess as to what this workload's going to look like 3 to 5 years from now. Because you can't go buy a new server every year. There's just no budget for that. Nobody's got time to do the migration. Once you move into this infrastructure as a service model, that all goes away. So even if you're using a VM and you need to resize, it's just a reboot. If you're using one of the PaaS services, you're just moving the slider. So you don't have that pressure to guess so well anymore. You just go with what you know, and then when things change, you change. Now, as we move into platform as a service, you see that area of responsibility shrinks even more. You're down to just applications and data. Starting to get kind of cool. As I got more senior in the DBA role, I found I had less time to do DBA things. How many people have noticed that? You spend a lot more time in meetings? Yeah. Doing budgets and things like that. Platform as a service really comes into, here, I just have to worry about the applications and the data. And if you're a DBA, you're just worrying about the data. If you're an app dev, you're probably just worrying about the application layer. It starts to get a lot simpler. Now, the ultimate simplicity is software as a service. This is where somebody else just handles everything for you. And really, you just say, I've got this many users, and I need this much space. And they say, OK, that's going to be this amount per month. Done. And we get to this next slide here. We see this in the data platform continuum. So we start up in the upper right with software as a service. And really, when you're architecting solutions, this is where you always want to start. We kind of talk about it as like falling down the steps of architecture. You have the software as a service, and that's where you're paying somebody else to manage that. Now, that should be the default going in. Like, you should try and run as much as you can in software as a service, because a lot of those applications, and I'll pick on SharePoint here. I had a very large SharePoint database that I was a DBA for. There was nothing I could do to that instance to tune it. Well, except for adding more CPU, memory, or disk. So if I wanted it to go faster, I'd go get money and just bigger hardware. I wasn't allowed to do any kind of fancy maintenance jobs. I wasn't allowed to go add indexes to the SharePoint database. There was really no business value I could drive. So there it was like, let's get that thing. Let's go let Microsoft manage that. Let's let that be software as a service. That's the kind of thing you're looking for, is can I drive business value by managing this system? So is there some unique skill that I have or unique domain knowledge where I can design an application better than something off the shelf? That would get you into platform as a service with Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, there you're saying it makes sense to manage the database on your own. You can build an app that's customized for your business. You can model your business much better than anyone else can, and that's where you would be. Now, there are situations, say you need really outlandish, well, not outlandish, but really high mem to core ratios. Say you need like a 32 gigs of RAM to 1 vCPU ratio. Or you need to be able to communicate with Oracle, and you have to install the Oracle drivers on your machine. Infrastructure as a service comes into play then. So it is going to be a bit more work. You do have to manage a VM out there in Azure, but you're able to have that flexibility. And as you see, as we're stepping down, we're making business-oriented decisions. We're saying there's value added in running infrastructure as a service over running PaaS. It gives me more control, lets me match what my business needs better. Now, moving down, you get into containers. So you've got SQL Server on containers, you've got AKS and Azure SQL Arc. This one's really tough because it just blurs the lines of everything. It says, I'm going to be everything. So it covers infrastructure as a service. You can also do it on-prem, though. So it kind of gets into the virtual area, too. This is where, say you want something consistent, you can move around easily. There's value in being really portable. Or you need to stay on-prem, but you want that cloud-type experience. That's where the Azure Arc is going to come in. Now, as we keep moving down, we get into virtual on-prem. I've had a few customers that were working with things that were dangerous. It's a good way to say it. Big machines that lift things and spin them around and set them down, where they couldn't take a dependency on the internet. Because if the internet went down, the robot might drop the thing it was working on, and it might go through the wall into the office where everybody's sitting, and that would be a bad day. Healthcare is the same thing. You wouldn't want to be hooked up to a machine that's dependent on the internet if the internet could drop at any time. So virtual on-prem gives you that high, basically high density, and that ability to not have to guess so hard and so accurately at what your sizing is, because you do have flexibility within that platform. So that gets you to virtual on-prem. And lastly, you've got the physical or the bare metal. What's interesting here is early on in my career, physical bare metal machines, we were talking huge, massive servers, big superdomes and things like that. But you can get those in VMs now. You can get those in Azure offerings. What you can't really get a lot of in the physical machines, the bare metal, is tiny little machines that go on the side of another machine. So for like production controls for manufacturing, or if you've got a bunch of devices out in the field like oil wells or something like that, that's where a lot of the bare metal lives now, is IoT devices. So again, there's business value in having these physical machines located somewhere. So that's why, that's kind of the drivers here. So, basically we start out at software as a service as our default going in, and then as it makes business sense, we move into more friction and control. Okay, so how does Azure SQL fit into all this? So we've got a pretty broad offering here. You see we cover pretty much that entire spectrum, except for software as a service. So we've got SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. That's going to be your lift and shift, or you need a DR node out there in Azure. And actually, I have to correct myself on that, because now we offer DR nodes on Azure SQL Managed Instance as well. You have the Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is a fully managed instance of SQL. All you do is worry about your databases. You've got SQL Agent, you run your jobs, you can do your maintenance and all those things, but you don't have to worry about patching or hardware or any of that. Then you move into Azure SQL Database. So that's where you just need a database. It could be a very large database. Hyperscale lets you go up to 100 terabytes, although they are looking for customers interested in going higher. And it's fast. It's really, really fast. How many people have used Hyperscale? Oh, wow. So, we got one. It's worth trying out. It doesn't make sense how fast it is. That's the best way to describe it, because you look at it and you think, well, it looks like it's going to be as fast as a general purpose machine, but for a lot of workloads, it comes in as fast as our business critical machines. And for reference, the business critical machines are running onboard NVMe. So Hyperscale is splitting everything out into basically a microservices architecture where each node has a little bit of the storage. So when you request something, it's all responding back at the same time. It's like a giant cluster on steroids. It's amazing. There's actually, I think Denzel's got a few more sessions this week. If you see Denzel Ribeiro on your schedules, he is the Hyperscale PM. Okay, finally you've got Azure SQL Edge, and Azure SQL Edge is for those IoT machines, those small. And then, across the bottom we've got Azure SQL enabled by Azure Arc. There's actually two flavors of Azure Arc. There's the Azure SQL on Arc. It's tough to get the marketing terms right all the time. So there's Azure SQL on Arc, which is a SQL managed instance running on Kubernetes clusters, fully managed by Arc. And actually, you can use whatever scheduler you want, Kubernetes Rancher, whatever. Then there's Azure SQL enabled by Azure Arc, which gives you the functionality, like if you wanted to do pay-go licensing, you wanted that flexibility to run variable workloads and things like that. This allows you to install an agent on any one of your SQL servers on-prem and actually have the Arc-enabled features. So quite a bit of flexibility there. And what we're working on is driving the cloud down into your business for those workloads that you can't move out, with the eventual goal of having just that one pane of glass to manage from. It's going to take us a while to get there, but that single pane of glass is really what our target is, our North Star. Okay, so getting into cloud migration phases, it's a basic rhythm. You discover, you assess, you migrate, you optimize, and then secure and manage. The hardest is the first two. The hardest, most time-consuming steps are actually the first two. Now you'd think migrate and optimize would take a lot of time. Not really. They're getting a lot easier. Our tools are getting a lot better. I'll show you the demo. You'll see. Actually, we're just doing an assessment there, but the migration can happen very, very fast. Now, discovery is probably the hardest part. Going into an enterprise and trying to figure out what workloads are running on all the different machines everywhere is really hard to do. You discover a lot of shadow IT, you discover things you didn't know about. There's ranges of IPs you can't get to. Doing that discovery process and getting your arms around everything is probably the hardest part of the process. And we'll talk about how Azure Migrate makes that easier. Moving on from that, assessing. So going through and doing an assessment on each of those boxes to figure out what it's running, what it's connecting to, how much is it, like what's it consuming in way of resources? What would it look like if I wanted to move this to Azure? Getting that whole picture, what is it going to look like? What's it going to cost? That's the assessment phase. When it comes time to migrate, you've really done all the work. You know what the easiest way from the assessment is. You know the easiest way to migrate. You've already chosen that. There's nothing to do but go execute on it. Now, if there's a lot of code changes, that can add time to it. But frankly, a lot of the off-the-shelf code and things that people are writing, they're not using a lot of the really extreme features of SQL or any of the other platforms that make it really hard to migrate. So migration tends to happen very fast, especially if you have good tools. Now, optimization and secure and manage really become long-term efforts. The optimized phase is really about going out and taking advantage of what you have available now that you're on Azure. Taking advantage of the different licensing models. Maybe on-prem you were stuck with a box that, once a year you had to do processing and you had to have 64 CPUs to be able to do that processing. But every other day of the year, you only needed 4 vCPUs or 4 CPUs. Now when you're in Azure, you can say, look, I'm just going to set it to 4, and then a couple days before that year-end processing, I'm going to bump it up to that 64, and I'll just pay the difference for those extra 60 SQL licenses for a couple days, and I'll turn it back down. I'll just borrow those CPUs for a few days. The other thing, we talked about that guessing 3 to 5 years out. Having enough extra in your machine to be able to make it 3 to 5 years out. I know personally when I was doing that, if one of my SQL servers got over 40% CPU, I was getting nervous. That was the red line for me, because it would take months, if not an entire year, to go get a new machine. Get it through the budget process, get it through architecture, get everything in line, do the migration, get moved to it. And if I had gone up to 40%, what's going to stop me from going to 60 or 80? So, being able to not have to worry about that in Azure means that what you can do is you can come in and say, well, this box never goes above 45% CPU. So where I was frightened at 40, now I'm saying this thing never goes above 45 CPU. Let's cut the CPUs in half. So I've got 8, let's make it 4. Because you're going from a situation where you have either a machine that you've bought that you have to live on for a long time, or you've got a VM that you're fighting for fighting for resources with other people. So you say, with a VM, you're saying, hey, I need 8 CPUs, but I'm on a VM and I'm fighting with other people. I'm going to request 12. Here you're saying, look, I just need what I need because I get everything in my bounding box. So I'm going to go through and set my servers accurately, and I'm going to let them run really hot, like as hot as I'm brave enough to let them run. And then finally get into secure and manage, taking advantage of things like Azure AD, a lot of the different auditing tools that we have. Being able to, Azure AD brings a lot with, having two-factor authentication right off the bat. There's a lot there. So let's talk about migration tools. That's what everybody came here for. The main migration tools here, we've got Azure Migrate, we've got the Azure SQL migration extension, and then we make sure for those that live in environments where everything has to be scripted, that we make everything available in the Azure CLI and PowerShell. So if you're using like Terraform or Bicep scripts and you have to get everything right in your dev test environment, and then that same script has to run in QA stage and then production, that's where the CLI and PowerShell come in. Where you can do, and actually, most people are going to run Azure Migrate through the GUI because it tends to be a one-time effort. You do a discovery across your enterprise, and it's going to allow you to do either a really wide discovery, or like in the example we'll see, we can do a lift and shift of an entire VM host. So you can do small for individual workloads, or you can go big and scan wide. We also have the SQL migration extension in Azure Data Studio, where your boss asks you, what's it look like if we want to move this SQL server or this database to Azure? And you can just fire up Azure Data Studio and right-click and see what it, have it do an assessment, see what it would look like. Both Azure Migrate and the SQL migration extension have SKU recommendations in them, which this used to be the hardest thing about moving anywhere in the cloud, was trying to figure out, how do I put all the different pieces together? If you've ever looked at the SKUs for our VMs, there's so many choices, and they all look like good choices. So how do you pick, amongst them all? And actually, I'm picking on David Pless again. He wrote a really good checklist for SQL VM that shows you, here's the best practice SKUs, here's the best practice disks, the things like that you want to do. But it still gives you 5 or 10 different options. Oh, not 5 or 10, 5 or 6 different VM SKU options to go pick from. What you can do with Azure Migrate and the SQL migration extension is you can collect data. You can take a perfmon on your own, or you can have it collect a perfmon for you. It's going to go see what you're using for CPU, for memory, for disk, and it's going to recommend the best target for you. So it's going to say you should use this VM with this disk layout, or it's going to say you should use this version of SQL managed instance, or this SQL database. It takes care of all that for you, so you don't have to work so hard to figure out what the target is. It really saves a ton of time. It actually makes you feel a lot better about the migration too, because you've got a good target. So digging into Azure Migrate, really it's meant to be a central hub for a migration. So it's probably not something you would run as an individual DBA, but if you were like an architect, or if you were doing some kind of enterprise PM work, you would be the one driving this, where you would look across the entire enterprise for, here's good candidates to migrate. And it's not just looking at SQL. It's looking at Windows, Linux, databases, web applications, virtual desktops. It's analyzing everything. So we actually put our stuff into Azure Migrate. That's how the relationship kind of works there. But it gives you that really wide discovery and assessment that really lets you get an idea of, like, how big of a project are we talking about for the entire enterprise? And then what's easy? Where can we start first? And kind of work at it from there. It also gives you centralized visibility. It has really, really nice reports. And actually, the holistic business case is a new report that we just got out there a few months ago. Oops. There we go. The business case lets you calculate the TCO, like what's the value in moving to Azure. And we're not using like made up values for, well, we have default values for what we think it is based on where you are, for like facility cost, electricity, internet, like your ISP costs and things like that. But we let you have full control over those assumptions. So you can go talk to the different people in the different departments, and you can put in your actual numbers, and we can tell you what the value proposition is for moving a particular workload to Azure or moving them all. It's a really cool way to look at it. And it actually lets you look at it a couple different ways. There's the minimum cost, like how much could I save if I just did everything at the minimal resourcing? What would it look like cost-wise if I did all IaaS? Or what would it look like cost-wise if I did all PaaS? And it's always interesting to see how it comes out with the results. But it gives you that idea of like, is this even worth doing? Once you've put your data in, you can see real quickly what your potential savings might be. Okay, so let's look at the SQL migration extension in Azure Data Studio next. The SQL migration extension is all about making the experience of moving an individual workload simple. It takes all of the automation and all the different places you need to go and puts them all under one place so you can step through it in a wizard-based format. So the idea there is you start a migration wizard and you're able to walk through the complete migration right there in Azure Data Studio without having to jump out and run scripts and do all kinds of different things. One of the things that sorry, I lost my train of thought there. One of the big things is that it helps you control the self-hosted integration runtime. So we actually use like if you're familiar with Azure Data Factory, we actually use a self-hosted integration runtime that we allow you to download and configure to move your backup files or move your data out there to Azure. So this helps you control that and configure it. Makes it very powerful. So some of the benefits, there's the integrated assessment. So you don't have to run that full Azure Migrate to get an assessment. You can go and do the assessment right there in Azure Data Studio. There's also easy setup and configuration. I mean, it's really easy. You install the extension. Everything else, if it needs you to go do anything else, it's going to give you instructions and walk you through here's how you do it. And then it does let you do online migrations for VMs and MI. We're hoping someday to be able to do online migrations to SQL DB, but that is a big challenge. We talked about the right-sized Azure recommendation, so I'm not going to make you listen to me say about that again. And kind of here's an overall view of how the migration extension does things for you. So you've got your SQL servers, and that extension is going to communicate with them. We see that over here. And it's going to handle the orchestration to the integration runtime. So it tells it, hey, we want to watch the backup location of this SQL server and grab those backups, push them out there to our storage account in Azure, and then use the database migration service to begin doing restores. Or if we're doing a logical migration, just move the data over. So it handles all the complexity of all the things you'd have to build yourself. It just does it for you. If you've done DBA work for a long time, there's only a few ways to move the data. So you can guess exactly how we're doing it, because we're doing it just the way you would. What we're doing is putting a nice cover on it to be able to say, this is going to work every time, and it's going to be easy. The setup's going to go fast. You don't have to go and do a bunch of work, write a bunch of scripts. You just next, done, and you're good. Okay. So this is the demo that I promised. What we're going to do in the demo is we're going to do a discovery on an entire VMware host and look at all the VMs on it, see if, see what it would look like to be able to move them to Azure.
From the appliance machine, we will open the Azure Migrate project page.
We're not getting audio.
We're going to click on Discover. Now we have to make a choice between performing an automated discovery or importing using a CSV. Automated discovery requires that an Azure Migrate appliance be set up. Choosing the type of environment takes us to the setup for the appropriate appliance. We will choose VMware. We're going to call this one demo appliance and then click Generate Key. Once the key has been generated, we're going to go ahead and download the zip file to the appliance machine and extract the contents. There is a README included with the steps to run the Azure Migrate installer.ps1 from an elevated PowerShell command line. This starts the install process. Once the installation completes, the Appliance Configuration Manager launches in a new browser window. If not, there will be a shortcut on the desktop to launch it. Since discovery takes some time, the appliance configuration we're looking at is one that we've run ahead of time. As part of the prerequisites, we have provided the project key generated from the portal. We saw that step earlier. And the appliance generated a device code, which we use to authenticate the appliance to our Azure account. We then added the credentials to the vCenter server user and mapped them to the vCenter server details. In the next step, we added domain and local account credentials to connect to all the servers and perform software inventory and network analysis. We also added credentials to SQL Server for discovery and assessment with all the credentials provided. We click on Start Discovery to initiate the process. Since we already ran discovery, we can connect to the portal and see the servers that have been discovered. Back on the portal, we can see we have 196 servers that have been discovered. We also see 105 servers have SQL installed on them, and 34 are web servers. One of the cool features of Azure Migrate is it can be used to perform dependency analysis. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and click on dependency analysis, and then we're going to select servers, or select add servers, I should say. Now this brings us to the dependency analysis add servers page. One of the cool things you can do on here is you can filter. So we're going to go ahead and type parts in here, and we can see that the parts unlimited servers have already been added. And for speed in this demo, we're just going to go ahead and go right to the dependency analysis that we've already done. So here we click on discovered servers, and we filter to parts. We see our part servers. So let's go ahead and click on View Dependencies. And here we see our dependency tree. So we've got our client, our parts web server, and we see we've got connections on port 443, port 80, and also 1433 down at the bottom there. So there's our SQL server. So let's jump back to the main page. We're going to create a SQL assessment. So we'll click on Assess, and then under there we'll select Azure SQL. So we're going to click on Next and go ahead and create a new assessment here. We're going to filter to our servers, just make it a little bit easier. So we'll type Finance here. We'll select our Finance SQL servers. Then we have to give this assessment a name. So we'll go ahead and type that in. Last, we need a group name. Let's click Next. And here we can review and create our assessment. Now, the assessments take a little while, so we're going to go ahead and show one that's already been done. Here we click on it, and we come in, we select our Finance SQL servers, and we see here's our assessment for our Finance SQL servers. If we scroll down, we can see that this is heavily favoring IaaS. The assessment is cost-based, and the machines that we had were standalone. If it was a true finance workload, you probably would want HA, and you're probably looking at SQL MI. So let's look at SQL MI and how that's an option for us. We can see that we had 9 instances that were blocked or not ready. So let's go ahead and click on the not ready to drill into the assessment and see what's going on there. Okay. So here we can see if we click on that first server that's not ready, well, we've got more than 100 databases. So that's a no-go for SQL MI, and we know that's the deal. So let's go ahead and close that. And let's click on one of the servers that is ready and see what's going on there. All right, perfect. So we see this machine goes well to SQL MI. We can use a general purpose with 4 cores and Azure Data Studio as a migration tool.
Okay. That is, like, for me, I think that's one of our cooler demos. I know my voice doesn't do it any favors. I got to get more dynamic, I know. But the idea that you can take an entire VMware host and do an analysis on it, and then go dig in on a particular application and see who's connecting to it, that is super powerful. Finding out what it would take to do the migration, what the target would be, and then here's the tool to do it. It gives you everything.
If it's not ready, can you treat it like a checklist, kind of, and continue to say, like, okay, let me scan again, I think I fixed it, and to get to that final?
Yeah, you can run it as many times as you want. So you can use it to iterate. You can even save off reports if you want to show progress. Yeah, and I should have said, feel free to ask any questions along the way. I did leave extra time in the presentation for that. Forgot my manners there. So optimizing your SQL Server environment, let's talk about that next. And once you've done the migration, you really need to optimize. Optimization really begins with a good assessment. So like we've been saying all along, the SKU recommendation is key. You want to assess your workload and you want to get deployment recommendations. You also want to make sure that you get a good assessment on your workload. So if you take like a perfmon that captures 10 minutes of activity on a Tuesday during lunch, that's probably not going to give you a really representative recommendation. It'll give you a cheap one. You'll save a lot of money because you won't need very much CPU or memory or anything. But when things get busy, you might be in trouble. What you want to do is you want to try and capture that busy phase in your business, month end, year end. If you can do month end with backups and CheckDB running, then you definitely have got a good server sizing. Make sure though that just like any other perf collection, you're getting it at peak or you're getting a wide set of data so that you can see what a good representative workload would be. The better your data collection, the better your assessment. The better your assessment, the more likely you are to just land it and be successful. Next up is verify the application. So what you want to do is, you start with the assessment, you look at it, find out what needs to be changed, but then as you do the migration, practice it. Verify that you're able to do the migration, test it, basically rehearse it. Just do it repeatedly in a test environment. Basically your new production environment is going to be test until you go production. And then once you're out in production, make sure to do a good verification. A lot of these cutovers are done on the weekend, and you want to make sure that the application's all set and ready to go by the time the users come in on Monday. Because that's really what you get judged by is the user experience first thing Monday morning. Make sure to configure, oops, we got a question on the screen here. Can you migrate stored procedures by default? I'm gonna message that person after and find out what they mean, because you can migrate stored procedures. The catch is if they're not compatible, if there's an assessment issue. So I'll message them, or I'll reply to this after the session and get more detail. Was there another one, or? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so next up is configure HADR. If you've got a PaaS service, you've got HADR by default. With IaaS, you are responsible for that. We don't have a tool that sets that up for you right now. Basically what you want to do is go out and make sure that you've had the conversations as part of the migration process about the SLAs. Like, how many minutes of downtime can you spare for HA? How many minutes of downtime can you spare for DR? DR is a destructive event, so how much data can you afford to lose for DR? That's going to drive a lot of conversations about like cost versus benefit. And they tend to be really good conversations because then you arrive at an architecture that everybody feels good about and nobody complains is too expensive. Make sure you're implementing best practices. A lot of the best practices stay exactly the same. The things that you've been doing for SQL Server on-prem, they're going to stay the same for SQL Server on IaaS or even SQL Server on a managed instance. It gets a little bit fuzzier on DB because you've got a lot less surface area. We take care of a lot more things for you, but there's still a lot of the same best practices. Also, the checklist I referred to about SQL VM, make sure you've run through that and you've implemented all those best practices. We changed the different backup options that are available to you. So there's different best practices that may actually get you to a better place. With the backups, Azure Recovery Vault is a great option. It backs up SQL Server IaaS machines as easy as it would be with a maintenance plan. Actually, it looks a lot like the maintenance plans did. And then it backs it up to a recovery vault where the data is safe. it takes multiple people to authorize a deletion of it. So if your machine gets ransomware and everything in your environment gets encrypted, they can't touch that recovery vault. You could just go delete your VMs, spin up new ones from the marketplace, and restore from your backups, and you're back in business. So things really change a lot, and taking advantage of those best practices can put you in a lot better place and get you out of trouble a lot faster if really bad things happen. And then finally, use the power of Azure. This is the biggest single piece of advice. Make your machines run hot. You can always go and get more. You just move the slider or reboot your VM, but you can always get more resources. Once you've got that machine running hot, do a reservation on it. And in fact, reservations, people tend to hold off because they're like, I don't want to lock in. And so I should say, I'm assuming everybody knows what a reservation is, but in Azure, we reward long-term planning. So if you say, I'm going to commit to running this, I'm going to reserve this compute for 1 year or 3 years, we give you really good discounts because it helps us do our planning and it helps us build our data centers more efficiently. So what you can do is you can do a reservation on a machine and lock it in at that 1 or 3 years. But what we also do is we allow you to do exchanges. So we look at it and we say, well, you actually want to do more business with us. You want to sign up for longer, or you even want to use a bigger machine. We're not going to stop you. In fact, we like that. So let's do another reservation. We can take what you had left on this reservation, we can roll it into the next one. So as soon as that machine gets out there, think about putting a reservation on it. You can always do an exchange to change that reservation, and as long as you're signing up for more time, they're going to let you do it. The only thing that doesn't really work well with reservations is if you say, look, I just want to return it. I don't have any use for this anymore. Then there's a restocking fee and limits and things like that. But as long as you're exchanging for something bigger or a longer term, it's perfect. So that's the two big pieces of advice: is run hot and use reservations and reserve early. But also look at other things. We're talking about like using the Recovery Vault via Azure Backup. There's a lot out there to take advantage of. Azure AD for your authentication. It's all there. Make sure you're taking advantage of those other features out there to really drive value for your business. Okay. The Azure Database Migration Guides are a great tool too. So if you go to aka.ms/data migration, that will list off all of the data migration guides. It's kind of blurry on this screen, but we've got everything from SQL Server to Oracle. I think we've got an area for Postgres, or maybe that's on my to-do list. Maybe I'm the one that's supposed to do that, so I shouldn't have called that out. But we've got basically anything you want to move from on-prem to Azure. We've got a migration guide out there that'll give you step-by-step guidance. More and more, it's going to just say run our tools. That's the idea, is as we get better and better at tooling, we want to make it so you can just run our tool and it's going to guide you through the process. We also have the Azure Migration and Modernization program, the AMMP program. This comes in two flavors. There's the self-guided that's open to everyone, and then there's the assisted, where they'll actually assign engineers to help you through the process. If you're doing like an individual application migration and you're not like a big company with a sales team, you're probably going to be in like a self-hosted. But if you're moving your entire data center, or the application's very large and complex and it's a lot of work, then there's a link on the page where you can actually apply for your project to be part of the AMP program, and they'll assign resources to help you move to Azure. And that's azure.com/AMP with 2 M's. Okay, so then getting started, we've got some links here. I know there's a few folks taking pictures of the screen, so I'll leave it up here for a few seconds. We've also got the additional resources, and I will, when I upload the slides, I'll have this in there for you. As far as summary goes, like we've talked about, make sure you're choosing your right offering. Make sure you're discovering across your enterprise with Azure Migrate. Use our tools to get your arms around everything. You can assess and get deployment recommendations with Azure Migrate, or if you just want to look at an individual workload and see what it would be like, you can use Azure Data Studio. And And then you can migrate online with Azure Data Studio as well. So we'll leave you with a call to action here. Install the tools, they're free. Try them out. Pick a workload to migrate. Start small. AdventureWorks actually makes a great database to migrate. Get your feet wet, see what it's like. And then do a proof of concept. Do something real. So, use DMA for your SKU recommendations. Deploy a VM or managed instance. A lot of folks really appreciate starting with something familiar, so VM or managed instance is a great place to be. And then, use Azure Data Studio. Give that a shot. Okay. With that, thank you.